who was it? Was it Martin Archer who had a question a second ago? Now we have to wait the 7-8 minutes of lag time and then the time for him to type. But somebody said they had a question for me in the comments. I think we'll take that and then we'll do it. Is that the question, Martin? Do I think that Patton was assassinated because he intended to testify to Congress about the waste of American soldiers' lives by Bradley and Eisenhower's slow-moving tactics after D-Day? Actually, Martin, what I believe is that a cart came loose from its whatever was securing it and rolled down a hill and hit General Patton and killed him. That's what I believe. When it says silence Patton makes a convincing case, no, it doesn't. I don't mean to be so unfazed about it, Martin, but it doesn't. I haven't read it, but let me tell you what I know already. When you say it makes a convincing case, there will be a series of evidence and data points that put in a line seem to make an argument that is so compelling that it makes a convincing case. But it's not a convincing case. And the reason it's not a convincing case is because of all the stuff that gets left out. Let's take an example of what I was dealing with, because this is the whole moon landing thing, everything, all of it. Let's go back to the Earl of Oxford thing, because this happened just a couple years ago, or maybe even less than 2 years ago. And I got to live through it, and it was a great learning experience. So let's talk about this whole convincing case thing. In the movie, was it Anonymous was the name of the feature film on it, and then the other one was Last Will and Testament or something, documentary about how Edward de Vere, 16th Earl of Oxford, was the guy who wrote Shakespeare's plays. And in this documentary, they listed a number of things. And as they start listing them, you know, that is odd. And here comes, well, now that's really quite a, and by the time you get done looking at this list of things, you're like, well, damn, it's open shut. It's open and shut. So let's take a couple examples. In specific examples, in the documentary, they say that William Shakespeare's 3 daughters were illiterate. That doesn't, it's nuts. How can that possibly be true? If William Shakespeare was this, half out of work actor who's basically the front for the Earl of Oxford, then it makes sense that his daughters are illiterate. But if he's the greatest writer in history and his 3 daughters can't even sign their name, how do you possibly explain that? Well, it turns out that you possibly explain that by saying that women were not given an education of any kind, no matter what your social background was, unless you were a absolute top-level royalty. No women got an education. Most of the population was illiterate, and virtually all of the women were too. They had no reason to be able to write their names. They didn't own any property. So, there. Well, kind of makes sense. Well, how come we only have these 5 signatures of William Shakespeare, and they're all written in this, and the handwriting is different all the time? Well, apparently, what I learned is that they were written on his deathbed in a will, and there were like little boxes inside which the leather was stretched, and he had to kind of write his name inside all of that, and then they showed me a picture of the boxes. Okay. And one by one by one. And some of them are just flat out lies. There's no record of William Shakespeare ever writing a play. Insanely, just plain wrong. And then when you start looking at the other side of it, then you find out things like, well, they would say, for great example. So de Vere set a number of his plays in Italy. Edward de Vere toured Italy. How could William Shakespeare, a bumpkin from Stratford-upon-Avon, write so knowingly about Italy? Well, first of all, he made a lot of mistakes about Italy. And secondly, he was using Italy as a romantic destination kind of thing. He wasn't writing about the details of the geography. But then you start looking at the other side of the question. And the other side of the question is, William Shakespeare, if you look at how his plays are written, and this is, you can make this point for every single one of his plays. If you look at how the plays are structured, you find out that, and I'm taking these numbers off the top of my head for the sake of an example, but if you have a play that has 30 people speaking lines, a Shakespeare play, you will find that you can do that play with 10 actors. They're all structured in such a way so that it is possible for one actor to go on and off stage, change costumes, and deliver those lines. And that is the result of somebody who grew up in the theater, who was an actor for most of his life prior to becoming a writer. That is somebody who lived in the theater. Earl of de Vere, Edward de Vere couldn't possibly know these things. Not possibly. Anybody could have talked about Italy, you know. People were writing romances about Italy. Shakespeare read everything. Hamlet is not an original story, by the way. He adapted Hamlet. There was a version of Hamlet called the Ur-Hamlet, the proto-Hamlet. And it's basically about a prince of Denmark who decides that his father was murdered and wants to know what to do about it. It wasn't written by William Shakespeare, but that's not the point. Hamlet was written by William Shakespeare. And everything that makes Hamlet Hamlet is William Shakespeare. The fact that that story existed prior to William Shakespeare doesn't mean that Shakespeare was a fraud. On the contrary, Hamlet is not about the plot. Hamlet is about the language and what the language is struggling with. To be or not to be, that is the question. That's Shakespeare. To be or not to be is not in the original story. In fact, see, this is why you need to hear the other side of the story. Because all I heard was that Shakespeare couldn't possibly be this guy. And then I started reading a number of books on Shakespeare, and the more I read about him, the more interested I became in him, and the more fascinated I became. There is a version, I don't have this thing, it's been too long since I read it, but there's like a first folio, and then there's all these different things. These are like editions of Shakespeare's plays. And somewhere in the reams and reams and reams of actual handwritten documents, don't let me forget handwritten, I'll come back to that. There is a version of Hamlet that sounds like it was written by no, I should have had this joke teed up. Well, it sounds like it was written by George W. Bush. Why not? There's a version of Hamlet where everything happens in the right order, but the lines are like, it's not to be or not to be. It's like, so should I go on with this? I don't know. It seems like it's kind of a waste, right? This kind of thing. And they found out that version of Hamlet was stolen by the actors that played the roles, who learned the words from Shakespeare off of the script, and then years later went out and wrote down what they remembered about the play and sold it as Hamlet by William Shakespeare, but they didn't have the original script. So they only had a memory of what they said. And since they're not writers, it comes off sounding ridiculous. And at the same time, it sounds absurd, but it is also exactly what happens in Shakespeare's Hamlet in the right order. These things are overwhelming, just overwhelming. And the final, I remember the biggest single point in this Edward de Vere movie was that, and they came back to this 15 times at least. How is it possible that that we don't have a single sample of William Shakespeare's writing? How is that possible? Well, there's a number of answers to this, and one of the bigger ones would be the Great London Fire of 1666, which burned the entire city, especially the theater district, to ashes, all of it to ashes. There was that fire took place over 6 or 7 days. There's a great book on the Great Fire of London. It starts out here, and it's like, okay, well, I got a fire. And then the second day, it's like, this is starting to get to be bigger than we like. Okay, well, it's still burning. Then it's like, okay, this thing's actually serious. Then it starts burning down the theater district. Then it starts moving up the hill, and it burned to the ground. But even that's not the point, because it's really worth doing if you have any interest in this at all. Just do a Google search for Shakespeare, and then the words hand D. In other words, one of the reasons why Shakespeare was easy to say that he wasn't Shakespeare was because the people who defended Shakespeare made Shakespeare into a god. He was a god. That no one ever is ever able to do this, and it just comes down to these untouchable, absolute miracle, and the idea that he stole the plot from Hamlet is inconceivable to the people that worship Shakespeare. Well, he wasn't a god. He was just a guy. He's the best writer who ever lived, and beyond a genius, he's just the greatest. He's the greatest writer ever, by far, no question. But he was still a guy. And so, so this documentary said there's not a single piece of evidence. We've never seen a play written in William Shakespeare's own hand. Well, great fire, but I'll get this for you too. One of the things that happened during those days, because these companies put on, these guys would put on plays. They'd put on 15 plays in a season, and they're just cranking them out. It was the beginning of this era when when people were getting entertainment. It was the beginning of popular entertainment. The whole idea, just inconceivable before that. You have a festival, and you get the maypole once a year. But this is the beginning of an age. And Shakespeare was in exactly the right place at the right time. Let me make sure this is it. It looks like it. Yes. I wouldn't go to the bank on this one, but I'm 95% certain. So, never ever has there been anything written by William Shakespeare in his own hand. Well, this is a play I think was written by Thomas More. And and I used to know this, the play, whatever the name of the play was, I've forgotten the name of it. But what they found was that the play, as written in the originals like this, the play was written in 4 different kinds of handwriting. In other words, 4 different guys collaborated on this play. And there's a lot of evidence that Shakespeare collaborated on 2 or 3 of his later plays. And people who study this thing recognize this part of the play and this handwriting definitely belongs to, I've forgotten his name now. It's not Roger Bacon, but a contemporary of his. And then this belongs to somebody else. But we don't know whose handwriting this is that we're looking at now. But the language and the structure and the pacing and everything is exactly like Shakespeare. And so we are left with the conclusion, very, very, very high degree of certainty, that what you're looking at is the handwriting of William Shakespeare. Christopher Wren and Robert Hooke rebuilt London. Yeah, I forget what the Marlowe. Yes, thank you, Martin. Smart boy. Marlowe was one of them, and there were a group of writers, and Shakespeare was like this young upstart, and somebody talked about this this black crow who pretends to have peacock feathers, and this kind of backhanded swipe at Shakespeare from a guy who was nothing like as good as Shakespeare, and Shakespeare was becoming more and more popular because his work was so good. But here he is. Here's a page from where Shakespeare is basically making a living as a writer, and he's making a living as a writer by collaborating with somebody else on a play to knock it out in time. Shakespeare, when the original theater he was working for, when they left and they started the Globe Theater, there were 7 partners, and Shakespeare was one of 7 owners. They owned the theater, and that means that whatever they took in the box office, he got, and he was a good money manager apparently, and so what they needed was enough plays so that you got the same Rubes and Hicks coming in every single night if you can. You got to constantly. You can't run a show for 3 months. The people that are going to see that play are going to see it within 2 or 3 days, and then you're out of business. So they just had to constantly change up the material, write new material. And Shakespeare was so prolific, but there are multiple examples of where he collaborated with other people, including the one I just showed you. And there you go. So all of this stuff that sounds so compelling when you just hear the objections, there's no sign of Shakespeare's handwriting. How is that possible? Well, fire burned everything, but turns out here it is. Well, his daughters were illiterate. Well, every woman was illiterate. Well, no, and it turns out that all of these things that when you hear them the first time that make such a compelling case, it just sounds so rock solid. When you actually go and look at the conventional side of it, the evidence is just overwhelming. So I don't believe that George Patton was murdered. I just don't. We might have talked about this once or twice before. Let me tell you a lot of what's going on with this. This explains the moon landing, explains 9/11, explains this Patton thing, all of it. This is really important. we are drawn to conspiracy theories because we grew up watching movies. And in movies, interesting things happen. In movies, oops, time to feed Bean and give him a shot. In movies, reversals happen. In suspense movies, you think you know who did it. Turns out it wasn't that person at all. We grew up on these things. This is all we've ever experienced. There are stories like suspense stories and thrillers that look like it's going to go one way. Turns out it went another way. And turns out that there was a big thing going on. You know, every single episode of CSI is about somebody who just, found bodies found someplace, and you find this incredible, intricate plot behind the whole thing. But that's not life. It doesn't work that way. Life is too boring to write about, and I know this to be true because I'm a writer. And so you heighten things and you invent things and you increase the contrast and the saturation enormously in order to make a point. And when you grow up on a diet of this is what you think life really is. You're supposed to think that the cops are all part of the crooked drug deal in the end, and you're supposed to think that this reporter was killed by a group of people who are, somebody came up with this example once. It's like, this whole thing is caused because, South Africans wanted to nuke the gold supply to drive up the price of the Krugerrand, this kind of thing. And it's just not true. And we expect it to be true because we expect there to be drama, but it's not there. And the drama never comes. Have you noticed? This is something I've been interested in too. The drama never comes. We're wired for it. We're built for drama. We expect it, and we worry about it, and we fear it, and it never comes. Remember Y2K? When the fact that they had made the first computers had such limited memory space that when the year 2000 came, all the computers thought it was going to be 1900, and since every single computer in the world had this, and since computers ran the traffic lights in air traffic control, for those of you that don't remember Y2K, everybody was in a full-on panic that when that clock went on December 31st of 1999, the computers would think that it was now January 1st, 1900, because it didn't have the extra digits. Okay, so everybody's in a panic, and everybody's saying, my God, the traffic lights aren't going to work. Planes are going to fall out of the sky. And Y2K happens, and what happened? Nothing. Nothing happened. Nothing happened. Now, a lot of people put money into buffing up their computer systems, but certainly, I don't know what the percentage of total computers in the world that had that dumped. I bet it's less than 1%. It just sounded dramatic, and it didn't happen. I remember when I was a kid and in Miami Planetarium, I was probably 13 or 14, and there was a comet that had been discovered. And this comet had been discovered further away than anything that we had any memory of. And so this was going to be the comet of a lifetime, the comet of a century. This thing, they were saying, we've discovered it so far out that as it gets closer and closer to the sun, we expect the tail of the comet to extend 45 degrees, which is essentially across the entire sky. And it's coming, and then people were panicking, and they were saying, my God, we're going to fly through the comet's tail. This is what happened with Halley in, was it 19... I want to say about 1912, something like that. Anyway, we're going to fly through the tail of the comet, and poisonous gases are going to come down, and everybody's panicking. And this comet, this earth-shaking event that at the very least, was going to be the most magnificent celestial picture ever in the history of the world, was called Comet Kohoutek. Anybody remember Comet Kohoutek? Comet Kohoutek wasn't just a flop. Comet Kohoutek was it was nothing. It was nothing. I saw it in a telescope. It was one of the worst comets I've ever seen. Comet Kohoutek, and everybody was talking about Comet Kohoutek and Comet Kohoutek and this and this and this. It's coming. It's coming. It's coming. And yeah, and as some people in the comment section are saying, they were talking about it exterminating all life on the planet and all of this. It was the miserable comet. Miserable. Hale-Bopp was far better. And this is the kind of thing. Remember the ozone hole? How we're all going to die? Because the ozone hole, there's a hole in the ozone layer and we're all done. The radiation's coming in and the hole's getting bigger and we've only got a few years to live. Remember that? And the killer bees, remember the killer bees, the Africanized bees that were going to come up from Mexico and kill all of us, and that never happened. And all of it, all of it. I have given this some serious thought, and I'm not saying this is the case, I'm just saying I've been thinking about this. I spent the first half of my life utterly convinced that I wasn't going to see the second half of my life, just like everybody else my age, because I was convinced that those damn Ruskies were going to send hydrogen weapons over and end all life on Earth, and those damn Ruskies were utterly convinced that we were going to do the same. And there have been so many scenarios with Bay of Pigs, and especially this one with where this one Russian colonel disobeyed orders to launch on a warning and didn't launch. Turned out it was a false alarm, obviously. But what I've been thinking about lately is that nuclear Armageddon was impossible. It wasn't just inevitable, and it wasn't just likely, and it wasn't like we could have an accident. The more I think about it, the more I realize that it is impossible. It's not impossible technically. It's just impossible because the consequences were so enormous that no one would have actually acted on it and pulled the trigger. I think that Soviet colonel is a great example. Here's a guy who comes from a society where if you don't follow orders, you disappear, and your family disappears, and that's that. And this, Arkhipov. And he's got his radar scopes lit up, and he sees incoming American warheads, and he's the guy who's supposed to launch those missiles, and he says to himself, I am not going to do this until I know it's real. Well, your orders are to launch on, I'm not going to do it. So he's basically saying, I'm willing to be taken out and shot, but I just won't do it. And what I'm saying is, that's interesting. And what I'm saying is that he didn't do it, and if he didn't do it, where the consequences for failure were so real and the entire population lived in such a state of fear, if it turns out that he couldn't do it, then I'm starting to think that it couldn't be done by anybody. It just couldn't happen. That there never would have been a point when somebody said, launch those missiles. I'm not saying those guys in the silos wouldn't have launched, but I am saying if somebody said to them, launch those missiles, well, the command structure was set up. This is why when people talk about Trump, Trump's got his finger on the nuclear button. Folks, nobody has their finger on the nuclear button. There isn't a nuclear button. The President of the United States cannot just say, you know what, I feel like nuking Iran right now. If Donald Trump were to say to the Joint Chiefs of Staff tomorrow, I want a nuclear strike against Iran, he'd be removed from office. You can't just do that, you know. You can't just say, this is, I feel like doing this, so I'm going to nuke the world and end civilization. No, you can't do that. Now, if Iran decided to let loose a small tactical nuke in Times Square, and then Donald Trump said, I want a nuclear strike against Iran, and that absolutely could happen. But that could happen only because of the hundreds of people who are involved in this process understand that there's justification for it. But he can't just walk into a room and say, you know, I've decided to nuke Russia today. I just don't like him. I say nuke him. Now, you could make the case that that's what George Bush did in Iraq, but George Bush could make a case for Iraq. I still think it's a good case, and George Bush wasn't talking about turning Baghdad into glass. So this whole thing is just part of our psychology. And Jodaba, who I've never seen before, makes a really, really interesting comment. And I got to look into this because this is really fascinating. He says Bill, they say that the human brain can only process 3 different outcomes, 3 different possibilities. One of them is 50-50, one is 0%, and one is 100%. That is profound. That is really profound. I got to really think about that for a long time. But that has the ring of truth to it, that We are, look, the reason we survive, the reason we're here, is because our ancestors had the ability to look into the future, imagine possibilities, and prepare for them. And those early humans who didn't have that ability are not here anymore, because they couldn't foresee that the hairy people from the mountains were going to come down with their spears, and so they're gone. But the people who were constantly worried all the time are the guys that constantly posted sentries outside the cave, and they're the ones that the leopards didn't get to, so this trait is passed down. It makes perfect sense to me. We're worry machines. That's what we are. We're built to worry about things. And the reason that our modern society is so neurotic is because we don't have anything serious to worry about. I'm not worried about Huns coming out of the hills and burning down my house. It's not something that keeps me up at night at all. So now I worry about other things. I worry about, do we have enough money to pay the bills? I worry about paychecks. I worry about the quality of the work. I worry about this. I worry about that. I worry about something. I just going to worry. I got to worry, though, because that's what we're built for. We're built to worry. We're built to worry. That's what we are. And if you can find a way to get that under control, that's good. And I don't say you should never worry. There are things that you should be worried about. People should always be worried about certain things. Some of these things are genuine threats, and you need to be aware of them. And going through life pretending they're not there is as stupid as pretending that the Huns are going to come out of the mountains. I don't worry about the Huns coming out of the mountains because I have an AR-15, and so do other people. That's why I don't worry about that particular thing. I don't worry about earthquakes. I've seen what happened to LA when LA got hit with a big, big, big earthquake. A freeway overpass came down, and I think one building partially collapsed, but you've got a city of 4 or 5 million people. A number of structures were condemned afterwards, but LA got hit with a big, big earthquake, and nothing happened. A lot of furniture got smashed, and a lot of things fell off of the countertops, but that's not something that I lose sleep over because I can get other things that were up on the countertop. I don't worry about that. And so it goes, you know. We just feel this. We just magnify everything, and we do it because it's a survival strategy, and it's built into us.